Mine? Does it have to show the picture before it's actually broken?
By right.
Because right now it's just showing the MIDP thing.
Yeah, then it won't live stream.
How do I do that?
It means the webcam's not connected. Then it won't stream our faces.
So right now what do you do?
Right now it will stream. Oh, we're live now. Okay, so everyone can hear our voices, but they won't see our faces. Let me just. And then. Okay, just turn on.
Okay. What did I say? Oh. All right. Yeah, I will back. Mr. Speaker, what a way to start the day. Everyone loves a good piece of meat in the morning. Now, being one of the 7 deadliest sins, we think that gluttony has done more harm than good for not only the human species, not only for our moral values, ladies and gentlemen, but for animals and the environment as well. The side of government today believes that ethical consumption is basically finding the right balance between the need for human sustenance and our responsibilities towards our fellow species as well as the environment. The side of government will then our case will be that the mankind's obsession with meat has done more harm than good to not only humans, not only to animals, but to the environment as a whole, ladies and gentlemen. We feel that currently, as things stand, that balance is tilted towards causing more harms to the environment and ourselves as well. So what is in and out of this debate, ladies and gentlemen? We believe this debate is about the need of human beings to consume food versus that overall impact to the environment. Secondly, we think this is a value judgment debate. We're not going to ban the consumption of meat, but even if we had to do so, I think Aditya, being a good Hindu, wouldn't mind so much. Thirdly, we don't think this is about individual choices or religious beliefs. We want to keep that out of this debate, ladies and gentlemen. We also think that this debate, we have to juxtapose this debate towards large-scale communitarian obsession with meat, not just like an individual's choice, because obviously one person's choice to consume meat isn't going to have as much impact as necessarily the entire human species having such obsession. In my speech, later Aditya, in my speech I'm going to talk to you about the sustainability of the environment as well as how our obsession with eating meat has surpassed our human moral values. But before that, a few clarifications and characterizations. Why is the human species so obsessed with consuming meat? Firstly, because we think that it tastes good, ladies and gentlemen. We think meat is necessarily more savory and more attractive than eating things like green vegetables and soy proteins. Secondly, we think that the consumption of meat has been tied towards, through cultural traditions, towards prosperity and indulgence and privilege, ladies and gentlemen. That's why the Sunday roast, the turkey dinner, the lechon in the Philippines, it's necessarily meat-based dinners that are associated with being rich and being privileged, ladies and gentlemen. Thirdly, we think that through things like the media, through cartoons, through TV shows, for example, food corporations have been able to pass subliminal messages to children that green vegetables and other forms of healthy food are something that is undesirable, something that's uncool, and not necessarily something that people should consume. But fourthly, we also say that meat is easily substituted, and all the necessary nutritions and proteins that we get from meat can easily be substituted through consuming things like soy or fish or like other forms of carbohydrate-based products like potatoes, for example. So we think that this debate is so we characterize meat as a privilege that human beings can give up and we should give up for other things, ladies and gentlemen. So first argumentation on the sustainability of the environment. Number one, we think that the large-scale communitarian consumption of meat has led to overwhelmingly led to things like global warming. Amongst dangerous gases that human beings produce, not only carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide, but also methane, ladies and gentlemen, happens to be one of the 4 anthropogenic gases which basically means that these gases never go away or take millions of years to dilute, ladies and gentlemen. So when when methane is produced through like farming cows and chickens, for example, basically it comes from like cow poo and cow farts, ladies and gentlemen. We think that this contributes towards the thinning of the ozone layer and the overall rise of global temperatures. The International Panel of Climate Change has already recently come up with a study that says that we are past the tipping point, ladies and gentlemen, where we've produced so much overwhelming gases, and there is no turning back. Methane is the #1 most dangerous gas that we produce. We're currently, the rates are something like 380 parts per million. We produce about 70,000 tons of methane gas per year, ladies and gentlemen. This is something that we need to curtail and we need to stop. Secondly, we think that the consumption of meat has also led to things like unsustainable farming. The problem with farming meat versus farming vegetables is that farming animals requires generally more space, but also when we farm animals, sometimes after about 2 or 3 farming cycles, that farm is no longer arable to be used for farming, ladies and gentlemen, and people usually have to start up new farms somewhere else. This has led to, for example, in Brazil, forests around the Amazon have been cut down and taken down in order to make up for more farms, ladies and gentlemen. We think that this has overall led to unsustainable farming and unsustainable farming techniques. Thirdly, we want to talk about farming techniques as well, because we think that the huge human or mankind's overwhelming demand for meat, a bit later, madam, the demand for meat has led to horrible farming techniques in order to meet those demands. Like, for example, like farm overcrowding, where chickens and cows are hoarded into small areas where they don't have room to roam or move because necessarily the production rate needs to be high. These chickens and cows are pumped with growth hormones and chemicals in order for them to grow faster, for them to be fatter, for them to be dumber, ladies and gentlemen, for us to consume them. Chickens, on average, a farm chicken only lives about 2 or 3 weeks before they are slaughtered, ladies and gentlemen. We have seen, for example, the rise of the assembly line slaughter, where you have literally machines that hold the necks of chickens while big blades come down and take their lives away, ladies and gentlemen. We think that the consumption of meat and that obsession has allowed us to bend the moral values of human beings. But before I move on, yes, madam.
Why does anything that you've said in the last 6 minutes suggest complete abstinence from meat instead of organic sustainable production?
Because we think that we've tried organic production, ladies and gentlemen. We've tried to spread messages like being vegetarian or being vegan. The vegan movement hasn't gained traction, ladies and gentlemen. We think it's much better if the whole of mankind abstains from meat in and of itself. But lastly, how it has allowed us to bend human morality. Now, it is apt to say that when we see a cat being run over by a car, or when somebody posts a picture of a dog being kicked on Facebook, these things are condemned by mankind. We support things like the WWF and other animal organizations. But the thing is, because slaughterhouses and farms are far away from our human peripherals, because these things are out of sight, they are necessarily out of mind. So we necessarily, we are against things like slaughtering or killing animals. We get sad when our pet dies, but because these slaughterhouses are far away and out of human peripherals, we think it has allowed us to bend our moral values in order to fill up those desires to consume meat, ladies and gentlemen. So we think at the end of this debate, not only has the consumption of meat led to negative impacts on our environment, not only has it led to us bending our moral values in order to slaughter these animals faster, but it has also bent our human morality in terms of how we view and treat animals. For all these reasons, stop eating meat.
Speech, now for the leader of opposition.
Oh.
Right. Mr. Speaker, I agree with most of what Rafiq said in his speech, that there are bad ways to kill animals and that's something that we must not do. But we think Mara ran a rather soft case. I think the motion somewhere call upon them to say that you should call out individuals who eat meat and as unethical and alienate them from the discussion for pro-animal groups. You tag them as unethical individuals and say that they cannot be standing on the same side as people who are vegans and people who support abstinence. We agree with all the consequences that he wants, right? Things like sustainable farming, things like a more propensity for individuals to consume things like organically produced meat. But that can only happen under our policy when we include individuals who are ethical consumers of meat but still don't dispense meat completely from their diets. I have three arguments for you. Firstly, why consumption is indispensable, something that he talked to us about, but never told us how the policy actually changes anything in and of itself. How do you convince individuals on the ground that eating meat is a bad thing? Secondly, where do you draw the line between ethics and practicality, Mr. Speaker? Because we think almost everything that the human race does has ethical consequences on other species. Where do you draw the line? Thirdly, what is ethical consumption, and how can it, and like I'm going to talk about what ethical consumption actually means. And fourthly, how their policy of calling these individuals unethical alienates support for ethical consumption, becomes harder for pro-animal groups to pass things like policies for sustainable farming or animal welfare standards in and of themselves. My rebuttals will be integrated, but a few points will stand out. Firstly, talk to us about the sustainability of the environment, that global warming is caused by cow farts. We will argue that the milk industry is also one of the largest contributors to global warming because they also have cows to produce the same kind of milk. The fact that you often ravage farms to create land for soy production also leaves the land completely infertile in the long run. The fact that the soy processing industry often uses technology, manufacturing processes which are also environmentally damaging is something that he should recognize. So never told us why the extent of damage with the meat industry is more than the production of things like corn, for example, or processing of wheat, which also requires things like natural resources and also takes away land from animals and also leaves them without a home to actually have. So that he never told us why that's specifically different or why that harm is exclusive on our side of the house. Going on to my arguments and my rebuttals will be integrated. Firstly, why is consumption indispensable? We will argue that it's a natural order of the human species and probably all other species of the animal kingdom to consume those below them in the food chain. That's why people started eating meat millions of years ago when they first roamed the earth, and the consequence of that has been the cultural and social significance of eating meat, right? The fact that in most cultures, eating meat is an indispensable part of your diet. In most cultures around the world, both Asian and Western, meat is an essential part for millions of people around the world. The fact that the meat industry is $1 billion industry and 90% of the world's population consumes meat, Mr. Speaker, for many social, cultural, or economic reasons, for example, that processing meat is far cheaper than accessing things like vegetables in many countries. Given the reality of that, given the fact that meat consumption is indispensable, what does their policy actually do? We think our policy far better accommodates individuals and leads to far better farming standards. Secondly, where do you draw the line between ethics and practicality, Mr. Speaker? Because we will say that the room that you're debating in now, or the house that you live in, or probably all of human activity has led to harms to animal species or other species in and of themselves. The fact that your house is probably built on land cleared where animals used to live before, and they are now homeless, Mr. Speaker. So we ask them, where do you draw the line between ethics and practicality, and accept the realistic consequences of this debate? So what exactly is ethical consumption, Mr. Speaker? Because ethical consumption can be things like not engaging in extremely cruel methods of culling, not having chicken farms in which chickens are force-fed when they are chicks, not electrocuting cows in the supply chain method that he talked about. We support things like free and open farming and organic production, and that can be easily implemented, right? Not supporting things like foie gras or shark's fin, which cause unnecessary pain and suffering and target vulnerable species. Like in shark's fin, for example, for shark fin soup, you take out a shark, you chop off their fins, and you put them back in the ocean. We support bans against those things and public movements against unethical treatment of animals, Mr. Speaker. We think the perfect model that we want to talk about are countries like Australia, who've implemented things like fair production methodologies. They've banned things like cruel treatment of animals, Mr. Speaker. Because any discussion of ethics and morality must lead to realistic outcomes for the species that you want to protect. Under your policy, you just say it's a value judgment debate and the animals can still go and fuck themselves. But under our policy, we say the fact that you include other individuals in this debate means that the people that you want to protect are far better protected under our policy. Yes.
But we wanted to say that we run a soft case when you want sustainable, moderate consumption with no real policy. So if you still legitimize meat consumption, how will society meet you halfway and reduce their demand magically?
Right, great. So this is why I talked to you about alienating support for ethical consumption. Because debates are all relative, right? Since the fact that they haven't told us any way of including any people in this movement, we think status quo is far better and their policy does more harm than good. What do we mean? Firstly, we will accept that status quo lacks support for things like ethical consumption. Why? There are three reasons for this. Firstly, ethical consumption is not a major voting issue. People in most elections, both at the town and country level, don't really care for animal consumption because there are much more pertinent issues at stake in most elections. Secondly, people often don't see the grim reality of production. The fact that most people are far detached from the way that the animals are produced or how they're grown, and often don't realize the consequences of what they're eating. And thirdly, organizations like PETA are usually extremely provocative and have almost always stolen the limelight in the discussion for pro-animal rights and haven't found much success. What does their policy or their value judgment do? They tag individual meat users or meat consumers who probably want ethical standards as being unethical. You alienate many conscientious supporters who campaign for things like ethical consumption, who campaign against things like supply chain production and culling of cows in unethical manners. You label these people as unethical and you remove the support base or the existing support base for things like pro-animal production. It becomes far harder to pass policies like fair farming standards like Australia has done when you label and exclude a majority of people who find that meat is an indispensable part of their diet and yet choose not to be cruel and support things like less violence against animals and less pain for creatures. Any end goal, be it a value judgment or a policy debate, of labeling a class of people as ethical or not, or excluding a class of people from any discussion, should have realistic, tangible outcomes for the people who you want to protect. Under their policy, they want to protect animals and want to save their lives. But they never showed us how their policy is going to reduce consumption or what people are going to buy into their policy or their value judgment. We said that support is low, but it's far better under a paradigm when you have a larger group of people who are willing to still continue eating meat but support things like ethical consumption. You alienate those people and make it far worse than status quo, Mr. Speaker. At least we don't do that harm. We support things like PETA videos. We support things like ethical consumers joining these institutions and supporting animal rights, Mr. Speaker. I'm extremely proud to oppose.
I think it's on again. It's still running, it's just no video. It's alright.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Here. Mr. Chair, representing my forefathers, my Hindu forefathers, I want to say that I really hate it when this kind of things happen. When government side comes out here to set up a value judgment debate, and opposition assumes that it is an imposition and has a model as well, and accuse us that our policy, ladies and gentlemen, will be harmful for humanity. What is this debate about? And let me clarify that clearly now in my speech. The debate is about should we or should we not take a position against eating meat. On a large scale, on a large communitarian scale, ladies and gentlemen, this debate is not about an imposition on a state level on individuals to stop eating meat. It's no longer a crime, ladies and gentlemen. It's not about individual consumption, ladies and gentlemen. What they are suggesting from that side is organic change. It's running a policy to improve and regulate the current harms that we have under the status quo. Ladies and gentlemen, the model to regulate farming or making farming more responsible is in existence right now. And it's not working, ladies and gentlemen. All the harms that Rafiq talked about is in existence right now. So we don't think that the kind of organic change, ironically, what they support is organic change, ladies and gentlemen, won't happen because of the nature of the things that are happening under status quo. And I'll talk about that a bit later. So this debate is about whether or not humans should live by eating meat or not, ladies and gentlemen. It's not about the balance, or this is a value judgment debate of whether or not we can do away with meat or should we continue to eat meat. It's not about creating that balance, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, we would invite them to, to rise to the occasion and debate that. Because we think, ladies and gentlemen, that the organic change that Aditya wanted to create cannot exist. Large corporations, ladies and gentlemen, in the United States, such as ConAgra or Monsanto, has huge amount of influence in policy making. Policymakers are vulnerable to state capture by this corporation, ladies and gentlemen, marginalizing people or NGOs in order for them to create the change that we need. So what we need right now, ladies and gentlemen, is a strong hard stance messaging in order to create that change. We think a soft stance, which is to empower vegan movement or to push for sustainable farming or sustainable consumption of meat, will not be effective because meat and its consumption is still in existence within our world. So we think we are unable to regulate how humans perceive the messaging, the soft messaging that you are trying to portray. We don't see how these people will gain traction within society, ladies and gentlemen. So what we have on the side of government, ladies and gentlemen, is to push for a hard stance against the eating of meat. They have to tell us why, ladies and gentlemen, this the practice of eating meat is a right and humans can live without. Because we think it is a privilege, ladies and gentlemen, because there are other alternatives for human survival. So, in order for us to analyze this debate, they have to prove to us how humans will not be able to live without meat, ladies and gentlemen, and how are they willing to eat meat at the cost of the things that Rafiq talked about, because it is currently happening right now, and we think a soft stance on eating meat, ladies and gentlemen, will not achieve the changes that we need. We are at the tipping point, ladies and gentlemen. They are willing to wait. They want organic change. We question them. How long would it take for individuals like you and me and small NGOs, ladies and gentlemen, to defeat large corporations like Agrocon and Monsanto, ladies and gentlemen, in order to create the change? How would your soft messaging impact the way people change their behavior? We think a strong messaging world, ladies and gentlemen, will enable people to create that change. I'm going to talk about how there is a duty of care on the part of human beings on animals, ladies and gentlemen, and that will directly clash with Aditya's argument on how it is, eating meat is an indispensable part of human beings. But before that, yes.
Rafiq talked about a lot of real-world problems, things like animal rights and environment. Is your position that we'd rather these problems not exist, or we magically hope that these problems will go away? Or do you actually have any way of reducing meat consumption in the long run?
Okay. This debate, ladies and gentlemen, is about recognizing that that problem exists and what approach should we take in order to deal with that problem. Is it an organic change model, which is indefinite? We never know. They never gave us a point in which the changes will be achieved, because you can say organic change, but we want a timeline on when it will happen. But furthermore, they never told us why soft messaging will be effective, ladies and gentlemen. So now let's look at why there is a duty of care. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that the concept of the survival of the fittest, it's not applicable or shouldn't be applicable to human beings. For it does, ladies and gentlemen, we have reduced ourselves to the character and nature of animals, where superior beings consume inferior beings and subjugate them, ladies and gentlemen. Why is this so? Of course, it is status quo, and it is something that we are used to by eating inferior beings or subjugating inferior beings, ladies and gentlemen. But we are humans. We cannot reduce ourselves to those ideas or to those concepts, survival of the fittest, for example, for several reasons. Because human beings have the intellectual capacity, ladies and gentlemen, in order to determine what is right and what would harm the ecosystem. And we think, acknowledging that fact, ladies and gentlemen, we think human being has a responsibility not to continue with the concept of survival of the fittest, consuming inferior beings. But secondly, human beings have the ability to appreciate life and appreciate or understand other beings' suffering, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, it is easy for them to say that we need chickens, we need meat to eat them, but no one wants to see a cow or a chicken being slaughtered. If we don't see, it's okay, ladies and gentlemen. But ladies and gentlemen, if you look at human compassion and the way in which humans react to certain things, if you see a hungry dog or hungry cat by the street, you feel something, ladies and gentlemen. You empathize, or you have the compassion to help these inferior beings. You are out of order. To help these inferior beings, ladies and gentlemen.
But when it comes to your selfish desire to, or your unquenchable thirst for meat, ladies and gentlemen, we think that human beings are able to surpass any morality or any compassion that they have in order for them to fulfill that. We think humans should raise above survival of the fittest and reducing ourselves in to the levels of animals. And for all of those reasons, we stand in proposition.
Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Before I begin my speech proper, a quick clarification. We think it's unfair for them to misrep our entire model as the idea of organic change, right? What we're really talking about is how our model is the best way to engage people out there, many people who are committed to consuming meat and will go on anyway. So what I really push for, right, is for moderating the production and consumption of all food, be it animal-based or plant-based, in terms of what nations can do, what civil society and organizations like PETA can do, what individuals can do, so that everybody can adapt basically their deeply entrenched lifestyles towards a model of ethical consumption. Let me start with a few rebuttals. Firstly, on Shafiq's very fluffy case on how humans are superior in kindness and cannot torture or hurt inferior beings. You know what? We agree. We agree with that principle. The issue is that they've taken that concept and run with it in very strange directions. Let us be honest, right? For human survival, consumption is inevitable. We are all going to tax resources whether we like it or not. All human actions therefore harm and subjugate animals, even in things like farming, where you clear land that was a natural habitat of animals to begin with. The point, therefore, is how we go about our consumption, how we manage, no thank you sir, our tax on the environment. Do we consume animals and plants responsibly? Or do we slice the fins of living sharks and throw them back into the sea and die? Furthermore, because we agree that humans are more intelligent organisms, right? So the issue with humans and ethical consumption is basically, we don't want to go out and just blame animal consumption blindly as the only cause of unsustainable living. Instead, we need to think about whether, say, a vegan lifestyle or abandoning animal consumption is really the way to go. So basically, right, if you think about ethical consumption, they talk about all these problems, right, animal rights, the environment, we agree, but they don't really tell us a way to solve it. If we remind ourselves, right, the ethical consumption is basically, no thank you sir, a sustainable and humane relationship with the earth, right? Our beef, pardon my pun, is that you can be sustainable in the way you eat meat, just like the way you eat vegetables. Basically, meat consumption can also be part of ethical consumption. So we don't need to prove to you that meat is essential, right? But that you can consume meat ethically. I'm going to go on then to look at the idea of balance and why they think it doesn't work. Before that, I'll take a point.
This debate is not about a policy to deal with this kind of thing. This debate is about whether or not we should, living with the status quo that we are in is better or not.
It's very weird, you know. You're saying the same thing twice, right? Yeah. Basically, the motion is about whether you want to abstain from eating meat or not. So what he has come on to tell me is, this debate is not about the policy on eating meat or not, it's about eating meat or not. Thanks, right, moving on. So basically, he came out and told me that balance doesn't work, right? But let me show you how balancing meat consumption in a responsible way is the only proper model to go about doing things. They came out in both speakers and told us that eating meat is a privilege you can give up. We don't agree. Many communities around the world lack the ability to supplement their protein demands that they now get through meat with things like soy. Not every community has the finances, the knowledge, or the ability to transport elements like soy around the world to complement a diet that will otherwise be overly rich in things like carbohydrates and therefore lack nutrition. This is especially the case in less privileged communities. In other words, many societies are able to give up meat, right? But many simply cannot do so. Also, we do consider that for many people, there is a cultural attachment to eating meat. But what is wrong with a cultural attachment? Since our culture is intrinsic to the humanity that Shafiq talked about in his speech. Our cultures are what really shape our ethical values, right? They make us even prize ethical consumption to begin with. That is why we think it's a legitimate reason to go on eating meat. No, thank you. Furthermore, they came and told us many harms, like how eating meat leads to global warming and cruelty and so on. But we have never really seen how abstinence solves the problem. Though they aren't really banning meat consumption, right? So I don't want to argue that abstinence doesn't solve the problem, but I will play on your grounds anyway. Because the issue is really, right, with the mechanism of producing meat, things like battery farming, things like clearing the Amazonian forest, all these cruel meats. So the issue, therefore, they want to prove is really moderating how we produce and consume meat to begin with. So that's why we go for things like, say, free-range chickens, like painless killings and so on. But even if, and we don't concede, that there is a need for you to abstain from meat consumption, well, I'm going to use their case against themselves and show why it will not work as they claim. No, thank you. One, they tell us time and again that the vegan movement has not gained traction despite many attempts to push it through. That is precisely why it's not going to work on their side to save the environment, right? Because they came out and told us from the very beginning that you do need mass traction, mass popularity for the movement towards ethical consumption to take place. Yet what they want, they concede, will not gain popularity. Furthermore, they came in and told us, no thank you sir, that farming hurts the earth, right? And we agree. We told you basically that when you pick out large-scale farming to replace meat consumption, if that really happens, use up a lot of land that used to be the natural habitats of animals, and you ruin its fertility as well, right? And so what you see, right, is that we are the ones, therefore, that truly ensure change. On both counts, they cannot do so. No, thank you. But we create better discourse. We allow for things like free-range labeling of products to take on popularity. We have caused things and the embargo on shark fin imports from Japan. So we are the ones that truly allow for any change to happen. But let's move beyond the present now and go on to my case. No, thank you. I'm going to look at basically the future of ethical consumerism. Basically, you realize that ethical consumerism, or being responsible for the earth, is also good for us as human beings, right? Because it ensures that we don't deplete the resources that we constantly need to feed off for survival. But we're going to realize, right, that ethical consumerism is getting harder and harder in the future. Why? Because we face two resources in the future. Firstly, a growing population that needs even more resources. And yet, secondly, our resources are also depleting. So it's harder to live sustainably and humanely in the world around us, and to watch out for things like the world hunger that results from overstretched resources. What is the only solution we have? That is technology. We already see it in play in things like green revolutions or new ways of producing more food at cheaper prices. These innovations make it easier and cheaper to access food at less cost to the environment. That is the direction ethical consumerism should be heading towards. But what are they doing on their side? And that's the problem. Under their paradigm, they don't accept meat as part of ethical consumerism. There is no way you can produce meat that will please them as being ethical or sustainable. And yet you're not going to change the minds of many people about consuming meat, right? The poor may want or need meat too much to care. The well-off will decide, I don't care for a stake in ethical consumerism if you deny me the meat so intrinsic to my lifestyle. So what they do it for, therefore, right, is to close off one sustainable way for ethical consumerism, to explore how to feed the population, because we neglect one big aspect of human consumption, eating meat, and how to improve upon it with technology. For all these reasons, therefore, we realize that it is possible, very possible, to eat meat sustainably, to eat meat ethically. It is the only way really to save our environment, to not exclude from this cause. For all those reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Mr. Speaker, this is the one and only clarification that you will ever need throughout the rest of the debate as to why side opposition completely missed the clash. It was clear from our first speech that we were never the side that said we would like to convert everyone to vegetarianism. We were never the side to undertake change as a burden. But through their case, their words, their positioning, they undertook that burden of proving that status quo is sufficient to prove those changes. We don't think they've ever fulfilled that burden. What was the burden coming from the side of government? We said this debate is whether or not we should or should not take an ethical stance as to whether or not the consumption of meat per se brings harms or benefits associated to just that consumption. Our burden is to show to you what social value that we should stand for as a community and tell people to do it, even if they never undertake it, even if they never change to tell people what is the right thing to do. How did they respond to that? By skirting the issue in several ways. I'll tell you how is that so under my speech. 3 questions. Firstly, is this a value judgment debate about proving outcomes? Secondly, let's look at a comparison of policy/cases. Thirdly, is consumption of meat in line with social morality? Let's look at the first question about outcomes. Because how did they respond to our value judgment debate? By skirting the issue in 2 ways. Number 1, they told you there are other things that are just as harmful on the status quo. Number 2, the imposition of value brings harms. Let's look at number 1 and other things that are more harmful. 2 ways where it doesn't solve the clash. Because just because something is harmful under the status quo, these are not arguments against saying unsustainable farming is not harmful. If these are just as harmful and you force us to take a side, we'll very happily take a side of containing and controlling and condemning all these unsustainable things that brings harms as well. So that's very easy to tackle. But let's look at that as well on 3 levels. They said other things such as vegetable farming can still be harmful. We have 3 main responses. Number 1, their characterization of harms is only applicable to cash crops. Those are the only instances where the land cannot be refertilized and cannot be reused. Cash crops are not for food, they are for fuel, Mr. Speaker. Most consumption of vegetables such as widespread, such as spinach, such as cabbage, such as kale, all of these have reached a level of sustainable farming and brings absolutely no harm to the environment or to the land where you fertilize these individuals. If they are unsustainable vegetable farming, we're happy to take them out of the diet because there's such a huge variety of sustainable vegetable farming anyways. But secondly, is this about making farming more sustainable? Because we told you that sustainable farming is already part of current regulations but fails. Why? For 2 reasons. Because you provide a platform for large-scale farming to happen. When large-scale farming happens, 2 things happen. Number 1, you force farmers to resort to overcrowding to cater to that demand. You force farmers to resort to efficient slaughtering that is inhumane. And secondly, it's impossible to moderate them and regulate them because you allow for large-scale farming and there's so many meat producers all across the world, and therefore regulation becomes unsustainable. So therefore, this is not just a debate about abuse, it's about abuse becoming an inherent harm that you cannot prevent when you say farming should happen. Here's the third response. We can only take a stance against unsustainable things as long as you balance out human sustenance. What we proved to you in Rafiq's speech is that there's no need for us to eat meat, but there is a need for us to eat vegetables. There's a substitute for meat proteins. There's no substitute for vegetable proteins. If we have to weed out one over the other to balance the sustenance, there are more harms associated to farming meat and less harms associated to farming vegetable. We're happy to farm vegetables because it brings more benefits and it balances out that human sustenance. Their second position is this. Imposition of values brings more harms. Again, bearing in mind, this bears no relation to the ethical standards of eating meat per se. This is just an auxiliary issue that is not related to the ethical consumption of meat. Let's deal with it anyway in 3 levels. Number 1, they seek to alienate moderate meat consumers. But if these individuals are as moderate as you say, these are individuals who are accepting of opposing values. More often than not, we won't alienate them because these are exactly the kind of people who are more likely to engage in a recalibration of mindset. This is exactly the kind of pool of people that we will be able to change their minds if the state takes a stance as to what social value is more valuable to you because they are rational, logical individuals. Second response, they said cultural and social values of eating meat are so entrenched. This is not a justification. Why? Because what else used to be a cultural and social value? Barbarism, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't mean just because someone practices in a social value, we should sustain it just because they believe in it. The state always forms social conditioning as to what is in the best interest of long-term sustainability of society. If we're able to prove to you those benefits, therefore the state should undertake this social conditioning as a beneficial value that society should uphold. Thirdly, they give you a last-minute response from the second speaker that everyone is poor, there's no way to bring in vegetables, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, this is about the states that can do it, should they do it. For poor state that has no democracy, I doubt they care about long-term sustainability of ethical consumption. But secondly, what is the reason for it being so expensive? It's because the trend is in farming meat. If we move away from meat and we farm more vegetables, that will create a demand that makes it cheaper, that makes the vegetables more accessible, that makes it the more important consumption of people within society. So we need a growing population to make the prices go down, and by taking a stance, we are attempting to push them towards that direction. So we give them the engagement they wanted, but let's recognize that none of those clashes dealt with the ethical standards of harms and benefits associated to meat per se. Let's look at the comparison of policies, but before that, yes.
Fiber and vitamin supplements can easily be used to substitute vegetables. Are you okay with that since we both conceive the harms of farming?
If we compare compare the harms of farming vegetables versus farming meat, meat is the #1 producer of methane, which is the largest contribution to global warming. There is no such likely harm that exists with farming vegetables. There's no comparison on that harm. Secondly, it's a comparison of policy. Let's acknowledge that they took a burden to create change via sustainable and moderate consumption. Two responses. #1, when you don't take a hard stance, people do not make concessions and meet you halfway. You're taking an extremely soft stance and suddenly expecting everyone to change their minds. We don't think they've shown to you the thought process that this is likely to happen. But secondly, your side still legitimizes meat consumption. When you legitimize meat consumption, many people will be validated by that stance that it's okay to eat meat. But the problem is, we don't think many people will be validated. We think a majority of society will all feel validated by your stance and will also continue large-scale consumption of meat. There's no thought process as to how you create the kind of organic change that you wanted. Lastly, most importantly, is this in line with societal morality? Let's bear in mind that we give you two moral stances that was absolutely not negated on this side of the house. We told you first that this is already in line with our social morality because we care and empathize with individuals who are suffering unnecessarily. But the reason why we don't follow this right now because we have a mentality of out of sight, out of mind. We need to bring this to the forefront of the societal conscientiousness to make sure that they agree, because they will essentially agree with their human instinct this is something that we should do. Secondly, and most importantly, Shafiq's point. We are human beings who are in a position of responsibility. We know we don't need to have survival of the fittest because we can survive without meat. We are the ones who fight for the rights of people who don't have rights, like children, like handicapped, who like to include the environment and flora and fauna within their definition. We are the party that appreciates life and appreciates that other people should not suffer unnecessarily. That societal morality is a social stance that the state should push forward in telling people what is right, what is wrong, even if they don't agree to it. Proud to propose.
Now for the final substantive speech, the main proposition of
At the end of this debate, you're not really going to understand what side government wants to achieve. Because every time we push practical feasibility on them, oh, this is a value judgment debate only, we don't want to deal with practical consequences, but we can't do sustainable organic production and deal with any form of moderated processes because it's not practically feasible and can't get any traction. They need to decide if they want to make this debate about practicality and what feasibly can or cannot get traction. Because they never told us on that side why it was possible to get traction for complete vegetarianism, but you couldn't get traction for the ability to moderate organic production of meat. If you buy the exact same logic that Shafiq wanted to give you, that people have the intellectual capacity to be kind and compassionate and protect lives, we think that's the exact same reasoning as to why organic, sustainable production of meat is possible, and we think that traction for it exists. It was very strange for Shafiq to spend so much time in his speech about how we don't have a timeline or how it changes and we don't have practical reasons of how it works, but ours is just an approach. It's not a plan. We don't have any intention of doing anything specific. It's just value judgment in general. You can't argue by caveat and say, well, those countries that can do it should do it, but other countries, screw it, it's not that important. Make up your mind and decide what you want to do. The most important things in two clashes in this debate. One, what is ethical? And two, how does it work? But before that, let's make one thing very, very clear. Debates are not always about most benefit. they're also about least harm to the positives of status quo. We think at the end of the day, when there are large amounts of positives in how status quo production has happened, we think that sustainable production has grown traction and requires the ability to pick on the very intellectual capacities of compassion and protection of life and create the ability for ethical consumption. That is why Norway has had sustainable fishing programs for years. That's why Australia now has a ban on cow electrocution. That's why most countries ban things like shark fin production or any of the other fishing barriers. Organic sustainable production is status quo in many countries around the world, and it's possible to grow traction in countries where it isn't. For them to say that, well, it hasn't worked, therefore it's not going to work, just suggests that you're going to regress any positives that have come out of status quo, because you alienate the people who as of now have attempted the progress towards these steps that Norway and Australia have taken by saying, well, everything you've done up to now really doesn't matter because you haven't achieved anything positive yet. The answer to it is just ban everything. Any form of consumption of meat is terrible. Before we go into what exactly is ethical, because they never really defined that for us in this debate, whoever go.
Our criticisms of you are valid because you were the ones who proposed a policy, but you have to clash with our values as to whether or not we should take a stance irrespective of being able to create the outcome of change.
Brilliant. Bringing me to what is ethical, because this is what they wanted, right? The question of the debate apparently was, should we take a position on eating meat, and what are the social values of that position? But the odd case is a position of on this situation that hurts the ability to solve those very problems that they wanted to talk about. The position that side opposition was willing to take was one of a stance of balance, where we were willing to accept that there were, yes, some moral consequences to it, but because of the practical ability to solve the problem in a better way, we were happy to concede that we don't want to take an arbitrary, completely moral stance of homogeneous acceptance of no meat whatsoever. Let's make one thing very clear. Does homogeneously disavowing all animal consumption completely just because there are some problems automatically mean that they are the side that's more ethical? They never really defined what ethical consumption was for us in this debate. We told you in Hui's speech and in Aditya's speech that consuming in a way that, one, reduces brutality, or two, is sustainable in the long-term future defines ethical consumption. What they never told us is why complete abstinence defines either of those parameters, or why complete abstinence was the way to prove or move towards reducing brutality or ensuring sustainability. But what we told you is that that stance actually makes ethical consumption far worse, because you completely exclude meat from the discourse of what is fair consumption and how much consumption you really can have of a particular product, whether animal-based or plant-based. It's a lie that you don't need meat whatsoever, and you can completely disavow it altogether. Sure, on an individual health nutrition basis, we think that an individual can find soy products to make up for it. We are not talking about individual health and nutrition here. We gave you analysis in Hui's speech about the long-term sustainable future of production for the world. We think when it comes to production, there is a bigger picture that needs to be taken into consideration than just individual nutrition and what the individual's health needs. In that scenario, you cannot exclude meat from any form of discourse of fair consumption. You cannot say, let's just not touch meat, period, and that solves all the problems. What social value should people stand for, and what's more valuable to you, as Mai wanted to put it? If the argument is that you can eventually change mindsets because at one point you thought barbarism was okay, and now you've eventually come to the point where barbarism is bad, we think that very same eventual change of mindset happens on our side when you can have your sustainable production and organic production. How does it work? It was extremely strange for them to say on that side that sustainable farming of soy and wheat has come to a regulation process, and we've come to an understanding of how to create sustainable farming of soy and wheat. But it's just not a possible process to get traction for when it comes to animals. We tell you that it's not just cash crops, and it was a lie from Mai when she tells you that the only kinds of crops that cause infertility in land are those that are made for fuel. Bullshit. We think that the the biggest kinds of crops that cause infertile land are your soy crops, your wheat crops, that cause infertile land and cause huge problems towards reproduction of the very same products. Sure, the argument on their side was, well, you definitely need veggies in life, but you don't need meat. We don't see why that distinction was in any way true. We think that supplements or any form of vitamins provide the very same fiber or vitamins that you need, that suggests that you don't need veggies as much, which means that just as much as you need to control sustainable farming of your soy and your wheat and your vegetable products, the very same processes, the very same traction, the very same emotional connection you make human beings have towards your crops is then applied to animal production to ensure that you have fair consumption and long-term sustainability. On that side, they didn't want to tell us what they were doing for these animals, because what they did was an overconsumption of vegetables and land production for your vegetarian items that ensured that the same amount of harm towards animals and the same kind of torture towards animals still existed on that side. We think at the end of the day, what is ethical doesn't automatically mean a homogeneous disavowing of something, but a practical consideration of balance between morality and actually working as a policy. We're very proud to oppose.
Opposition reply.
So our Earth is dying. It has limited resources, they are being depleted. So it is fair on both sides to agree that we need to rethink the way we use the environment as intelligent human beings with a concern for humanity and the world around us. Let's put it in very simple terms. When I next go to the supermarket to buy things for my Chinese New Year reunion dinner, say it is customary for me to buy fish. That is the key source of nutrition for my family and also something that is culturally very important to us because of its significance of prosperity. Do I have to give all that up to save the environment? Is it necessary for me to pick up a soy or a vegetable product instead? And will that actually do any good in the long run? So first and foremost, to answer that question on effectiveness, we must first understand what the problem really is, right? And why when you use abstinence as a solution, you get a huge problem-solution mismatch. So we came and told you that given the way to characterize the problem, the idea that the way you produce meat may lead to global warming, the fact that battery farming is callous and cruel, the issue really is with the mechanism of producing meat. We think that therefore, what people really don't want is cruel means of getting ourselves meat to eat. We therefore don't see how abstinence is really the way to solve it. But even if we concede that maybe abstinence is a solution that fits the problem, and we don't, right? We don't really think how their model of social conditioning without a ban is going to work out. We don't see any effect of that whatsoever, simply because I told you that it's not going to work. And I think they agree with that people are not going to care. So it will be a state saying, you know what, meat is really bad, and the rest of the world going about eating meat anyway. We also told you that even if it did work out, even if people gave up meat, and although many less privileged communities can't, right? But even if everyone did, we realized that excessive farming to make up for the lack of animal protein could also hurt the earth, as seen from the careless clearing of land that were used to be natural habitats that animals lived on instead, so that you can have farming areas. So we don't really think their model truly works. But they want to talk about value judgments, right? Because the minute they lost the policy, that, oh no, it's a value judgment debate. But fine, value judgment. How do I then take a stance about whether I eat meat or not? And this is why the discourse point that Mitra brought out is so very important, right? The discourse point they tried to walk into the idea of impositions of values. Unlike what Mai says, this point matters because Rafiq came out and told us from the start that mass traction matters, that you want people to believe in this cause. And also because Mai came out and told us for things to work, you must bring ideas to the forefront of people's minds. That is why we told you, we don't want you to alienate people, right? Especially this alienation of meat eaters is unnecessary to save the world, as I've proven. That's why I also came out and told you, we must think about the future and how to make sure that technology continues to look not just at sustainable vegetable production, but also sustainable meat production. All that unengaged on their side. And that's problematic, because this point on this course is the most important in the debate if you only want to look at value judgments. Their idea of social conditioning, on the other hand, is extremely inferior, because they are not consistent in how they defended its universal benefit. At the end, they say, oh, we only want to preach to the converted, because they recognize that many people will not believe in our value judgment anyway. Lastly, they came up with this very false burden in a mistaken attempt to clash with us, that farming would happen and it's, I don't know, painful and so on. So here is a central misunderstanding. We do agree that farming, when misused, is harmful. Say, if you farm food crops that drain the earth, or you farm food crops that meet the high demand of vegetables, then you don't allow time for crop rotation for the earth to still stay arable. Basically, it's just like how the excessive and irresponsible killing or rearing of animals is harmful as well. And that is our point that I failed to clash with, right? That what we really want is the moderate production and consumption of both meat and vegetables. Because they have missed our stance on it, they have failed to clash with us on both a practical and principle level. So really, right, the next time I go to my supermarket, I don't really have to give up all meat for things to work. It's as simple as that. We can instead look for things like free-range products. There are so many other ways to go about ethical consumerism, and that's what we stand for. I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Oh, Rafi.
Me.
You have a pork chop after this.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I've never been in a debate where not only does my brain hurt, but my stomach hurts too. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this debate was about two worlds. Let's be clear about that. On the government team, we wanted a world with zero consumption of meat, where everyone abstains from meat. Now, of course, it's a utopian world, it can never be done, but we think that that world was a lot better. Their world was status quo, where they wanted fair and balanced consumption of meat while sustainably farming it. They pushed for organic change. They wanted sustainable farming and PETA to get involved and all these lobby groups to find sustainable methods. They talked about Australia and all their methods and how that works. The difference is they wanted us to also defend that model, ladies and gentlemen. They wanted us to also defend somehow organic change in order to create sustainable farming methods as well. They wanted us essentially to debate the debate on that tee. We don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that that was our burden. It was funny, Mr. Speaker, as well, that they wanted to push for sustainable farming methods and change human consumption behavior, but at the same time saying that all those methods can't be used to sustainably farm things like soy or sustainably farm things like fish, ladies and gentlemen, because apparently soy is too expensive and people don't really like to eat fish. If we can prove, so that at the end of that, the burden on our team is that if we can prove that as long as you allow people to consume meat, that they cannot control that consumption and that this would still lead to the problems that we have today, then we win the debate. So the debate is, can people control consumption whilst being allowed to do that? So the first question, is it possible to consume meat while sustainably producing it? Opposition said, any human act has ethical consequences on the environment. That was really deep, Aditya. Secondly, there are a variety of ways in which we can sustainably produce meat whilst reducing the impacts on the environment. Now, first response, we said, meat's not a human necessity. The same nutritions and sustenance can be easily substituted for things like soy, fish, or eggs. Secondly, we asked them, how far can you take the sustainable farming of cows? Because at the end of the day, however sustainable it is, you will still need to have cows. Cows will still fart and poop, which produce methane, and methane will inextricably harm the environment, ladies and gentlemen. thirdly, we say that so as long as you support like controlled consumption, the power of social demand will always override the need to farm sustainably. So as long as people are still allowed to buy and consume meat, that will spur farmers to continue to hoard their keeps with cows and meet the quantitative needs of society. They completely ignored my argumentation about the environmental impacts of methane. This isn't about letting them roam free. This is about them, their actual produced methane. We also talked to you about the cultural association that people have, that people associate meat with privilege. So all those argumentation about how people can easily give up meat is not true, especially in the cultural societies that you talked about, because people assume that meat is something that is for the privileged, meat is something desirable, and they will never give it up. Then there was a contradiction on that team, because they characterized the current status quo as, well, politicians don't really care about animal rights, people don't really get behind the movement, but at the same time telling us that there is a small minority of like moderate meat consumers who are happy to push for reforms in parliament, ladies and gentlemen. We don't see how that organic change can happen when the overwhelming majority of people will still not care about that movement and still choose to consume it in whatever way it means necessary. So in this clash, we've proven to you that although under their team they can say perhaps people might be able to control meat, control the consumption, we said it's better they don't consume it at all, because inextricably cows do pollute the environment. Second, the minor issue which they completely ignored, is there a moral way to consume meat? On opposition team, they said, oh, we can have more humane slaughtering techniques. It's still slaughter, guys, it's wrong. What we're saying, ladies and gentlemen, on government team, is that there isn't a way, because at the end of the day, again, right, the very fact that people are allowed to consume meat and that farmers are allowed to have these slaughterhouses will override their need to slaughter humanely. The fact that they build slaughterhouses far away from neighborhoods, out and disconnected from individuals, is the very way that human beings bend their morality in order to feed their desires. Ladies and gentlemen, if we truly care about animals, and we all do, then we should stop consumption of meat, and we are very proud to propose.
And the big announcement.
Oh, it's a great announcement.
Silent round.
Oh, lucky you.
I think I'll still be under either way.
Let's grab some meat now.
You know this is the running, right?
Uh-oh.
And
No meat. Oh, meat.
Hang on, let me turn this off. Is this a silent round?
Yeah.